we'll see what happens in the soccer tonight. I'm a Canada fan, so but thank you for having me back. It's always a privilege to celebrate Pride Toronto with my friends at Holy Trinity. Today we celebrate relationship, a God who is relational, and that's what I want to talk about this morning. Thank you to those who did the readings and to Allison for the music. That's fantastic. As I've said before, I'm not a pastor, I'm a storyteller. So for my homily today, I'm going to quote a few pastors and share a couple of stories. And there's a doozy of a story in our Hebrew scripture reading this week. In my copy of this translation, the New Revised Standard Version has headings for stories. I don't know about yours. This story is headed The Testing of Abraham. However, these headings aren't actually part of the Bible text, and this heading implies a point of view. It suggests that this story is about Abraham, or God. But in Hebrew tradition, this story is called the binding of Isaac. In Genesis 22:9, the Hebrew text states that Abraham vayakod, meaning and he bound his son Isaac to the altar. This is the only time this verb form is used in the entire Hebrew Bible. And the episode became known as the Akedah, the binding. Isaac would have experienced this episode very differently from how Abraham experienced it. Reams of theology have been written about the binding of Isaac, and you'll be relieved that I'm not going to take you through that. I would just point out a couple things. In Christian tradition, it's hard to escape the parallel with the story of Jesus laying down his life for humankind. Traditional language speaks of God the Father sacrificing the life of his son. One parallel with this is that in Jewish tradition, Isaac is a willing participant in this story. The Bible is silent on this point. But the Midrash, which in Judaism is an imaginative interpretation of scripture, has it that Isaac knew what Abraham had been called to do and was ready to lay down his own life, just as we later learned that Jesus was. And so the binding was Isaac's idea. Indeed, this Midrash describes Isaac's concern for Sarah, his mother, and what she's going to think about this whole adventure. Isaac says to Abraham, "Well, Father, how are you going to break the news to Mother? Don't tell her while she's standing on the roof. She might fall off," which I think is a nice touch. But I want to note the end of the story, which is that after the testing of Abraham, the binding of Isaac, God provides another way. God does not actually demand the sacrifice of Abraham's son. God notes Abraham's wholehearted response and lets love for Isaac prevail. The end of this story depends on Abraham's willingness to listen to God, to let God provide this new answer. Jewish interpretation points out that God emphasizes this by calling Abraham's name twice the second time. Abraham, Abraham. It has been noted that if Abraham had been a fanatic, he would not have listened to God. He would have decried God's second call as a false voice, trying to deter him from what he thought was God's will. And he would have gone through with killing his child anyway. But that is not what God demands. Which brings us to pride. What this story of Abraham and Isaac brought to mind for me are the many parents over the years who've been challenged by the knowledge that their children are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, who have experienced their sons or daughters coming out as a testing, much as Abraham was tested. This new knowledge may have posed a challenge to what they believed was the right future for their child. or God's will. I remember the 1980s, the AIDS crisis, when gay men, many gay sons, were abandoned by their families of origin in sickness and even in death. Too many of those families failed the test. Their response was not that of Abraham, but that of the fanatic. They sacrificed their children, their love for their children, on the altar of what they believed was God's will, what they had learned as a religious command. That is not what Abraham did. Abraham had thought that God required him to sacrifice his son, but that is not, in fact, what God required. What God required of Abraham was to love Isaac. God is relational. Today's epistle reading from the letter to the Romans promises, "Sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace." Now, sin is not a term a lot of us are crazy about, and I don't blame you. We don't like it because of the way that doctrine has been abused over the years in the church. Most particularly on Pride Day, we are aware of particular clobber passages in the Bible that have been used to clobber LGBTQ people in and frequently out of the church. Too often in the history of the church, sin has meant something that tempts other people, right? We don't usually preach sermons about our own weaknesses. We hear about hating sin, but it's too easy to hate what's wrong with other people more than what is wrong in our own lives. As human beings, we're tempted to do this, to think that person, those people have the wrong beliefs, the wrong belief system. They must be a little less loved by God. This type of condemnation often comes from the right politically, but it can come from the left too. You believe wrong. You are not welcoming. You are not our kind of people. Elsewhere in this same letter to the church in Rome, in chapter 3, verse 23, Paul writes that all have sinned and fall short of the glory. Sin is defined as falling short of the glory of God, for which we were all created. That glory of creation came to be called the doctrine of the image of God, imago Dei. Please forgive my pronunciations. Sin means separation from relationship with God and with our neighbor. One might even describe the rupture of such a relationship as hell. Some of you may have read The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. In describing its vision of hell and heaven by contrast, the Reverend Canon Dr. Jennifer Smith says, "Hell was a place of continual twilight where people moved further and further apart into infinite space, driven by mutual suspicion. Paradise, by contrast, was a place of color, fruitfulness, and sunshine, open to anyone bold enough to stay. In paradise, people were not afraid of each other or the future. They sought out newcomers, working to convince them to remain." Seeking out newcomers, working to convince them to remain. That kind of welcome has characterized Holy Trinity, and it should surely characterize the church if we want to make a difference in the world. If we believe that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is truly for everyone. So much of what is going on in the world is transactional. Deals are made, stock sales, peace plans, quid pro quo. I recently came back from Rome, so that explains the Latin. Even much religious understanding has strayed into the direction of transaction instead of relationship. Too often, Christianity is portrayed as a kind of transaction. You do a deal with God, and in return, you obtain personal salvation. You, not your community. But God is not transactional. God is relational. Pastor Aaron Carlberg writes that the purpose of Jesus' coming was to restore relationship between God and us again by removing what stood in the way. And he names that as sin. He goes on to say, as Christians, we must get away from the idea that Jesus died so we could get out of this place and watch it burn. Jesus died and rose. The heart that Jesus had for this world should burn in us with a passion and intensity. That sounds more like the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And because the gospel reading today is very short, only 3 verses, let's just hear the end of it again. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me. This is one of those places in Jesus' teachings where he kind of boils everything down to one succinct point. And I have a story about it. Some years ago now, my partner, Trish, and I were traveling around the world backpacking. It was 2018. Donald Trump was in his first term as US president. But we were on the other side of the world, camping in the Northern Territory of Australia. Now, one of the things you might know is that Trish is English, whereas I'm originally from the United States. Nevertheless, when we used to get a beer in hot weather, she preferred cheap American beer, which I would never order. This is an Anglican church, I can say this, right? So we've been hiking in the heat and humidity of Australia, and then we got to our campground in Katherine, Northern Territory, and cooled off in the pool. And after our swim, we spent some time at the poolside bar. This was a change for us because we've been camping through the outback for about a week. The bartender was from Singapore. And before I could ask about his country of origin, I like Singapore, he asked about mine. This happens sometimes when I order a Budweiser for Trish, and I want to explain that it isn't for me. But he pegged me as being from the US, and so, of course, wanted to talk about the president. I said no more than, well, and off he went about the Clinton scandals and how one thing he thought Trump did right was to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel because he, the Singaporean bartender, was a Christian, if you can follow that. I should have taken the opportunity to say that I do pray for our leaders, but I was waiting for Trish's beer, and so I just said something non-committal about nobody being all bad, which may not even be true. Then the bartender said that he had heard that the vice president, Mike Pence, at that time, was a very strong Christian, and we need someone standing up for Christian values, don't we? Well, really, what could I say? How could I possibly convey to a devout Singaporean what Mike Pence's Christian values mean to a lesbian exile from the USA? In any case, there was little chance for me to speak. The bartender was still marveling that although many Australian people and some European backpackers come through Katherine, only once in a blue moon does someone from America stop by. And he threw in a free bag of chips and brought over a big pitcher of cold water, as if he'd just been reading Matthew 10:42 that morning. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water. Proving once again that the lasting impression of someone's faith isn't what he says he believes, but how he treats others. The Gospel of Matthew is about what you did with other people. As Sean Patrick Connolly writes, you cannot run Matthew through the transactional machine. It is stubbornly about what you did with other people. For Jesus, of course, the scriptures were the Hebrew scriptures. And if you go back to the beginning, to Genesis, certainly the first doctrine we see is the Imago Dei, created in the image of God. The thing about Jesus' gospel is that there is something in it to make everyone uncomfortable. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were scandalized at some of the people he welcomed at table with him because they worked for the government or because some of them were women whom he treated with equal dignity and respect. I was brought up short by seeing the gospel in a Singaporean bartender. We aim for what Jesus in Matthew's gospel called the kingdom of heaven, in which people aren't afraid of each other, but seek out newcomers. Yet when we start to list examples of all the different people who are created in the image of God, there's always something about the list that bothers us. There's always someone whom we don't want to see on this list, or whom we don't want to be next to on the list, which is what you would expect if indeed we are all made in the image of God, without any exceptions. I've borrowed this morning from the language of several ministers, and I'm going to end with Keith Dawkes, who made this point very clearly. Notice that despite his conservative tradition, Keith speaks of someone made in God's image, using the generic pronoun they. Here goes. Too many preachers don't preach the truth of the Imago Dei, which is that God created every human being in his image, which means every person has dignity and value. Every person bears the image of God. Every person has great value and is worthy of respect and equity, no matter who they are, or what they believe, or how much money they have, or what neighborhood they live in, or what they have or have not done. Every human has worth. Both women and men are made in the image of God and have intrinsic worth and dignity as humans. People of every race and ethnicity are made in the image of God and have intrinsic worth and dignity as humans. The vaccinated and unvaccinated both are made in the image of God and have intrinsic worth and dignity as humans. Atheists are made in the image of God and have intrinsic worth and dignity as humans. Democrats and Republicans are made in the image of God and have intrinsic worth and dignity as humans. The LGBTQ plus community are made in the image of God and have intrinsic worth and dignity as humans. Members of Taliban and extreme Islamic groups are made in the image of God and have intrinsic worth and dignity as humans. Every human has intrinsic worth and dignity because every human was made by God and bears his image. And the gospel is for everyone. The gospel is for every person, including me and you. God bless you all. Happy Pride.